Your choices aren't real. I want you to notice something right now. In this exact moment, reading those words, something happened. A response arose, maybe resistance, maybe curiosity, maybe a kind of intellectual discomfort that feels different from ordinary disagreement. And if you're anything like most people encountering this claim for the first time, some part of you wants to push back immediately to say, that's obviously wrong. Of course my choices are real. I chose to read this. I could stop right now if I wanted to. The experience of choosing, the felt sense of being an agent, of deliberating, of deciding, is the most immediate and undeniable thing I know. I understand that reaction. I share it in a certain sense. And I'm going to spend this conversation treating it with complete seriousness, not dismissing it, not talking around it, because the argument I want to make is not that your experience of choosing is an illusion in some trivial sense. It's that the physics of the universe, the actual mathematical, experimentally confirmed physics, leaves no room for the kind of free will that your experience seems to be telling you that you have. And the gap between what physics says and what experience says is, I think, one of the most philosophically significant facts about the human condition. Understanding that gap, really understanding it, from the ground up, following the physics carefully, changes something. Not necessarily what you do, but how you understand what you do. And that understanding has consequences that reach into ethics, into law, into how we treat each other, into what it means to praise or blame, to reward or punish, to feel pride or shame. This is not an abstract puzzle. It's one of the most practically important questions in all of philosophy. And physics has something specific, rigorous, and deeply uncomfortable to say about it. Let's find out what. Let me start with the most powerful argument for the absence of free will. The argument that requires the least controversial physics. The argument that if you accept Newtonian mechanics, the mechanics of Isaac Newton, which most people have at least heard of, already removes free will completely. The argument is called the argument from determinism, and it goes like this. At any given moment, the universe has a state, a complete description of every particle's position and momentum, every atom and every star, every electron and every brain, every photon traveling between galaxies. This state completely specifies the present configuration of everything that exists. The laws of physics, Newton's laws, applied to all these particles, tell you, given the state at any moment, what the state will be at the next moment. The evolution is deterministic. The future state is completely determined by the present state plus the laws of physics. There's no wiggle room, no place where the next moment could have been different. The universe is, in this picture, a gigantic clockwork machine, unimaginably complex but fully deterministic. Running forward, step by inevitable step, from the Big Bang to the heat death of the cosmos. Now, your brain is made of particles. Your neurons are made of atoms. The atoms are made of protons, neutrons, and electrons, which are, as far as classical physics is concerned, particles governed by Newton's laws. Every thought, every decision, every moment of apparent choice is, in this picture, just the deterministic evolution of the particles in your brain according to fixed physical laws. The state of your brain right now, the precise configuration of every atom and every neuron, every neurotransmitter molecule and every synapse, every ion crossing every cell membrane, was completely determined by the state of the universe a second ago, which was determined by the state a second before that, which was determined by the state at the Big Bang 13.8 billion years ago. In other words, every choice you will ever make was, in a specific physical sense, already encoded in the initial conditions of the universe. The Big Bang, in some deep sense, already contained your decision about what to have for breakfast tomorrow morning, not because anyone calculated it, but because the laws of physics applied to the initial state. determine every subsequent state with mathematical precision. This is determinism. And if determinism is true, if the physics of the universe is genuinely deterministic, top to bottom, then free will, in any meaningful sense, is impossible, not difficult, not constrained, impossible. The feeling of choosing is real. The choosing itself, in the libertarian sense of genuinely being able to have done otherwise, is not. Now, I can hear the objection forming. You're thinking, but quantum mechanics is not deterministic. Quantum mechanics has genuine randomness built in. The decay of a radioactive atom happens at a random time, not determined by any prior state of the atom, but genuinely, irreducibly, fundamentally random. The measurement of a quantum state produces an outcome that is random in principle, not just in practice. Doesn't quantum indeterminism rescue free will from the deterministic grip of classical physics? This is a natural and important objection. And the answer is no, for a reason that I think is even more interesting than the determinism argument. Randomness doesn't give you free will. Randomness gives you randomness. Think about what it would mean for your decisions to be influenced by quantum randomness. Some radioactive decay in a neuron, or some quantum fluctuation in a protein, or some collapse of a quantum superposition in some biological structure in your brain produces a random outcome. That random outcome, amplified through the brain's complex dynamics, influences your decision. You choose X rather than Y because of a random quantum event. Is that free will? Is that what you mean when you say you have the freedom to choose, that your choices are determined by random quantum events in your neurons? That doesn't sound like freedom. It sounds like noise. It sounds like your choices are out of your control in a different way, not determined by prior causes, but still not controlled by you. Random causation is not the same as agent causation. A decision that's partly random is not a decision you're making freely. It's a decision that's partly happening to you. The philosopher Kant saw this clearly over 200 years ago. He noted that free will, as we ordinarily understand it, requires something more than the absence of determinism. It requires that the agent you be the source of the decision, that the decision flow from your reasons, your values, your deliberation in a way that's genuinely up to you. Neither determinism nor randomness provides this. Determinism makes your choices the product of prior causes. Randomness makes your choices the product of chance. In neither case are they genuinely, in the libertarian sense, up to you. So quantum mechanics doesn't rescue free will. It just replaces one problem with a different one. But here's where I want to dig deeper, because I think the most interesting version of this discussion isn't about determinism versus randomness. It's about what physics has revealed about the nature of time. And time, it turns out, has something extremely important and deeply counterintuitive to say about free will. We talked in our conversation about relativistic particles, about space-time, the four-dimensional fabric of the universe in which 3 dimensions of space and 1 dimension of time are woven together. And we touched on the block universe picture, the idea that space-time is a 4-dimensional manifold, and that all events past, present, and future exist with equal reality within that manifold. I want to spend real time on the block universe, because I think it's the most devastating challenge to free will that physics offers. Not because it's more certain than determinism. The block universe is a philosophical interpretation of the physics, albeit a very well-motivated one, but because it strikes at something deeper. It doesn't just say your choices were predetermined. It says your choices have already happened. Let me explain. In Newtonian physics, time is special. It flows. It has a universal present, a moment that is now for everyone, everywhere, simultaneously. The past is fixed and gone. The future is open, not yet determined. in any ontological sense. Time is like a river carrying everything from the known past toward the unknown future. Einstein destroyed this picture, not accidentally, as a direct consequence of the mathematics of special relativity. We established that simultaneity is relative, that two observers moving at different speeds disagree about which events are simultaneous. For observer A, event X and event Y happen at the same time. For observer B, moving relative to A, event X happens before event Y. There is no fact of the matter about which is right. Both descriptions are equally valid within their respective reference frames. But now consider what this means for the concept of now. If there's no universal simultaneity, if now means different things to different observers, then the boundary between past and future is observer dependent. What is future for me might be past for someone moving relative to me. There is no universal objective now that separates the fixed past from the open future. And if there's no universal now, then the distinction between past, present, and future is not a fundamental feature of reality. It's a feature of our perspective, of our particular position and motion in space-time. The four-dimensional space-time manifold, the block universe, contains all events at all times with equal ontological status. The Big Bang is there in the block universe. The heat death of the cosmos is there. Your birth is there. Your death is there. Your reading of these words is there. Every moment of your life, every apparent choice, every deliberation, every decision is there, fixed, real, equally part of the four-dimensional structure. The passage of time, the sense that time flows from past to future, that the present is special, that the future is open, is not a feature of the block universe itself. It's a feature of how conscious beings embedded in the block universe experience their particular four-dimensional path through it. The flow of time is, in the block universe picture, something like the experience of reading a novel. The story seems to unfold page by page as you read it, but all the pages exist simultaneously. The ending is already written. The apparent unfolding is a feature of the reader's sequential engagement with a fixed structure. Let me try to make this more concrete, because the block universe can sound abstract in a way that obscures its real impact. Imagine the entire history of the universe, every event, every particle interaction, every thought, every decision laid out as a four-dimensional structure, a hypercubic block of space-time, with every moment of time represented as a three-dimensional slice of the block. Your life, from birth to death, is a four-dimensional tube through this block. At one end, the configuration of matter that constitutes you as an infant. At the other end, the configuration of matter that constitutes your final moment. And in between, every moment of your existence, every thought, every feeling, every apparent choice is a particular three-dimensional slice of that tube, fully determined by your position in the block. The moment of your choosing to have coffee rather than tea this morning is a particular slice of that tube. It exists. It's there. It has been there since the block universe was set in its current configuration, which in the four-dimensional picture was always. The block doesn't change. It exists as a whole, timelessly. The event of your choosing is no more alterable than the event of your birth. Now, within that slice, within the moment of apparent choosing, there are neurons firing, deliberation occurring, feelings of weighing options, and arriving at a decision. These experiences are real. They're fully present in that slice of the block. But their outcome was never in any meaningful sense open. The slice is what it is. The decision is made. Not made in the sense of being actively determined by you at that moment. Made in the sense of already being the way it is in the four-dimensional structure. This is the block universe argument against free will. And I find it in some ways more challenging than the determinism argument, because the determinism argument at least leaves room for the idea that you, as a physical process, are the cause of your decisions. The block universe removes even that. It says the decisions aren't being made, they already are, timelessly, as fixed features of a four-dimensional structure. Now, I want to introduce the neuroscience, because we've been talking about physics so far, and I want to bring the argument into the specific domain of human brains and human decisions. Because the neuroscience adds a dimension that is, if anything, even more immediately unsettling than the physics. In 1983, a physiologist named Benjamin Libet conducted a series of experiments that have become the most cited, most debated, most contentious results in the science of free will. And the basic finding has been replicated, refined, and extended in the 40 years since. Here's the setup. A subject sits in front of a clock, a specially designed clock with a fast-moving dot, and is asked to flex their wrist whenever they feel like it, whenever they want to. No prompting, no signal. Just whenever the urge arises, and they're asked to note the position of the dot on the clock at the moment they first become aware of the intention to move. Meanwhile, the subject is connected to an EEG, an electroencephalograph, measuring electrical activity in the brain. And what Libet found was this. There's a characteristic brain signal, a slow buildup of electrical activity called the readiness potential, or Bereitschafts potential, that precedes voluntary movements. It begins typically about half a second before the movement itself. Not surprising, you'd expect some neural preparation before a movement. What was surprising, what caused decades of controversy, was when subjects became conscious of the intention to move. They reported becoming aware of the urge to flex their wrist about 200 milliseconds before the movement, but the readiness potential began about 550 milliseconds before the movement, which means the brain's unconscious preparation for the movement started about 350 milliseconds before the subject was consciously aware of any intention. The brain started preparing the movement before the conscious mind was aware of deciding to move. Let me say that more starkly. In these experiments, the neural cause of the movement preceded the conscious experience of deciding to move. The decision was being made at the neural level before consciousness knew it had been made. This result has been interpreted by Libet himself and by many subsequent researchers as evidence that conscious will doesn't initiate voluntary actions. It arrives after the initiation has already begun in the unconscious neural machinery. The conscious sense of I am deciding to move is not the cause of the movement. It's a kind of post hoc awareness of a process that was already underway without conscious involvement. Now, Libet himself drew a more nuanced conclusion. He noted that there was a brief window, about 200 milliseconds, between conscious awareness of the urge and the actual movement during which the subject could, in principle, veto the movement. Consciously suppress the urge. He called this free won't, the ability to cancel an action that the unconscious brain has already initiated, rather than the ability to initiate it freely. This is a significant qualification, and I don't want to dismiss it. The veto hypothesis is a serious position, and some subsequent research has looked for neural correlates of successful vetoes, finding activity in inhibitory cortical circuits that is indeed associated with conscious suppression of initiated movements. But the veto hypothesis has its own problems. If the veto is itself a neural event, if the conscious suppression of a movement is itself caused by prior neural states, then it's not clear that the veto is any more free than the original impulse. The veto might itself be the product of unconscious neural processes that precede the conscious experience of vetoing in exactly the same way the original impulse was. And more recent experiments using fMRI rather than EEG, allowing better spatial resolution, have found something even more striking. John Dylan Haynes and colleagues at the Charité Hospital in Berlin found that certain patterns of activity in the prefrontal and parietal cortex could predict which of two choices a subject would make up to 10 seconds before the subject reported making the decision. 10 seconds. In 10 seconds of neural processing, the brain's activity already encoded the outcome of what the subject would consciously experience as a free choice. The subject sits there, experiencing deliberation, feeling the weighing of options, sensing the moment of decision, and all the while, 10 seconds earlier, the neural pattern has already determined the outcome. The experience of deciding is real. The decision being made in that experience of deciding, that's what the neuroscience is calling into question. Now, let me address something that I think is important to be honest about. There's a significant debate in neuroscience and philosophy about the Libet experiments and their successors. Not everyone agrees with the interpretation I've described. One objection is methodological. The readiness potential might not be a motor preparation signal specifically. It might reflect a more general state of readiness, fluctuating attention, or the preparation for any action, including the decision itself. The signal starts before the conscious intention, but maybe the signal doesn't directly cause the movement in the way the free will is an illusion interpretation assumes. Another objection is conceptual. The Libet experiment is specifically about simple, arbitrary movements. Flex your wrist whenever you feel like it. This is not typical human decision making. Most important human decisions involve extended deliberation, consultation of values, weighing of consequences, input from other people. The extrapolation from when to flex your wrist to whether to change careers or whether to help a stranger might be a step too far. I take these objections seriously. The neuroscience is not as clean and settled as some popularizations suggest. The hard version of the claim free will is proven to be an illusion by the Libet experiments, overstates what the experiments show. But the softer version stands. The neuroscience is consistent with, and in many ways supports, the view that conscious deliberation is not the initiating cause of our actions in the way we intuitively believe. It suggests that a great deal of what we experience as free choice is post hoc awareness of processes that have already been shaped substantially by neural machinery operating below and prior to consciousness. Combined with the physics determinism, or the block universe, the picture that emerges is coherent and challenging. The physics says your choices are determined by prior causes or are features of a fixed four-dimensional structure. The neuroscience says the conscious experience of choosing doesn't correspond to the initiating cause of action in the way you think it does. Together, they suggest that the intuitive picture of free will, the one where you are a conscious agent standing outside the causal flow of the universe, deliberating freely and choosing your future, is probably wrong. But here's where I want to end this first part. Not with a negative conclusion, but with the question that the negative conclusion forces. If free will doesn't exist, or exists only in some attenuated, compromised sense that falls far short of the intuitive picture, then what follows? What are the implications for how we live, for how we treat each other, for the concepts of responsibility and desert and punishment and praise that organize our entire moral and legal world? Because those implications are not obviously what you'd expect. The absence of libertarian free will does not straightforwardly imply that nothing matters. It doesn't imply that we should treat people who do harm exactly like we treat malfunctioning machines. It doesn't imply that our emotional responses to each other, gratitude, resentment, admiration, contempt, are inappropriate or irrational. The implications are more subtle, more interesting, and more practically significant than the simple claim your choices aren't real might suggest. There's a tradition in philosophy going back to David Hume, developed by more recent philosophers like Daniel Dennett and P.F. Strawson, that argues free will is compatible with determinism. Not the naive libertarian free will of common sense, but something that preserves everything that actually matters about our practices of holding each other responsible while being honest about the physics. And there's a more radical tradition associated with philosophers like Dirk Pereboom and scientists like Robert Sapolsky that argues the incompatibilist conclusion stands and that its implications for our justice system, our moral practices, and our self-understanding are profound and urgent. These are the questions I want to dig into. In part 2, I want to go deeper into the physics, into what the block universe really implies, into what the most sophisticated philosophical responses to determinism actually say, into whether compatibilism is a genuine solution or an elaborate evasion. And I want to tell you about what neuroscientist Robert Sapolsky, in his recent remarkable book on the subject, has argued is the most important practical consequence of taking the science of free will seriously. Because the question of whether your choices are real is not just a puzzle for philosophers and physicists. It's a question with direct, immediate, consequential answers about how we should structure our society, how we should respond to crime, how we should think about punishment, and what it means to live well in a universe that may have left no room for the freedom we thought we had. That question, what do we do with the absence of free will, is, I think, one of the most important questions of our time. And the answer is not what you'd expect. So we'd arrived at this genuinely uncomfortable place where both physics and neuroscience are pointing in the same direction. The physics says your choices are either determined by prior causes or are fixed features of a four-dimensional space-time structure. The neuroscience says the conscious experience of deciding doesn't correspond to the initiating cause of action in the way you intuitively believe. Together, they suggest that libertarian free will, the kind where you genuinely could have done otherwise, where you are the ultimate originating source of your decisions, is almost certainly an illusion. Now I want to push harder into the philosophy, into what the smartest defenders of free will actually say in response, and into why I think those responses, while sophisticated and genuinely illuminating, ultimately don't escape the core problem that physics poses. But I want to start with something that reframes the whole discussion in a way I find clarifying. There are actually three separate questions that often get conflated when people talk about free will, and keeping them distinct matters enormously for figuring out what's actually at stake. The first question is metaphysical. Is libertarian free will the kind that requires genuine ability to have done otherwise? Causal origination from the self that transcends physical determinism, compatible with what physics tells us about the universe? This is the question I've been addressing, and I think the honest answer is almost certainly no. The second question is psychological. Is the experience of deliberation, of weighing reasons, of feeling yourself as an agent making choices, real and meaningful? And here the answer is clearly yes. That experience is genuinely happening. It's a real feature of what it's like to be a human being. The question is what it corresponds to in the underlying physics, and the answer might be more interesting than either it's real free will or it's a complete illusion. The third question is practical. Should we hold each other responsible for our actions, and if so, on what basis? This is the question with the most direct real-world consequences, and it turns out to have an answer that doesn't depend on the metaphysical question being settled. Let me work through all three. On the metaphysical question, the most serious response to the argument from determinism is compatibilism, and I want to give it a genuine, sympathetic treatment before I tell you why I think it falls short. Compatibilism is the view that free will and determinism are compatible, that you can have both simultaneously, that a deterministic universe is perfectly consistent with genuine freedom and genuine moral responsibility. It's the majority view among professional philosophers, surveys consistently show that more than half of academic philosophers who have thought carefully about this question identify as compatibilists. The compatibilist argument has several versions, but the most compelling one goes something like this. When we say someone acted freely, we don't mean, and we never really meant, that their action was uncaused, that it violated physical determinism, that they could have done otherwise, in the libertarian sense. What we mean when we say someone acted freely is something more practical and more mundane. They acted in accordance with their own desires and reasons without external coercion or constraint in a way that reflected their own character and values. A person who donates to charity because they value helping others acts freely, even in a deterministic universe, because the action flows from their own values. A person who hands over their wallet at gunpoint doesn't act freely, not because the laws of physics have been suspended, but because external coercion is present. The distinction between free and unfree action is real and important, the compatibilist says. And it has nothing to do with whether the universe is deterministic. The philosopher Daniel Dennett, probably the most eloquent and sophisticated defender of compatibilism, argues that libertarian free will is not just unattainable, but incoherent. What would it even mean for an action to be truly uncaused, to originate from the agent in a way that transcends physical causation? Would it be a random event? We established that randomness doesn't give you free will. Would it require some non-physical soul causally intervening in the physical brain? That's dualism, with all its well-known problems. The libertarian free will that we think we want, Dennett argues, is something nobody should want, because if you had it, your actions would be disconnected from your reasons and values. They'd be arbitrary. That's not freedom. That's chaos. What we actually want, what we actually mean when we want free will, is that our actions flow from us, from our reasons, from our values, from our deliberation. And that's fully consistent with determinism, because even in a deterministic universe, the chain of causation can run through our reasoning processes rather than bypassing them. This is a sophisticated and genuinely illuminating argument. And I think Dennett is right that the libertarian free will people imagine they want is incoherent. I think he's right that the compatibilist notion of freedom captures something real and important. But I think the compatibilist account leaves something out, something that matters. Here's my problem with compatibilism. It redefines free will in terms of the absence of external coercion acting from one's own desires and reasons while remaining silent on whether those desires and reasons are themselves freely chosen. And they're not. They couldn't be. Your values, your character, your reasons, the things that the compatibilist says make your action free when they flow through them, these are the product of your genes, your upbringing, your experiences, your culture, your neurobiology. You didn't choose your initial values. You didn't choose the formative experiences that shaped your character. You didn't choose the neural architecture that processes reasons in the way it does. In other words, compatibilist freedom says you act freely when you act from your own character, but you didn't choose your character. Your character was given to you by biology, by circumstance, by history. So if acting from your character is acting freely, then your freedom is ultimately grounded in factors that were never in your control. The philosopher Galen Strawson made this point with a clean argument he called the basic argument. It goes like this. To be truly responsible for your actions, you'd have to be responsible for the character from which those actions flow. To be responsible for that character, you'd have to have formed it freely, which means you'd have to have had a prior character from which you formed it freely, but that prior character would also need to have been freely formed, and so on. The regress never bottoms out in something you genuinely chose. You can never get to the origin. You can never be the ultimate source of yourself. This isn't a refutation of compatibilism. It's a statement that compatibilism, whatever its merits, doesn't give you what the word free in free will seems to promise. It gives you a notion of freedom that's real and practically important, but it's freedom light. Freedom as relative to your given nature. Not freedom in the deep sense that would ground ultimate desert, the sense in which you truly, ultimately deserve to be praised or blamed, rewarded or punished, in a way that goes beyond the practical utility of those practices. Let me now bring in the neuroscientist Robert Sapolsky, because I think his version of the argument is the most comprehensive and the most practically urgent. His 2023 book on free will and determinism is, in my opinion, one of the most important books published in recent years. And what makes it distinctive is that Sapolsky approaches the question not as a philosopher, but as a biologist, not with abstract arguments, but with accumulated scientific evidence about the causes of human behavior. His central argument is simple and devastating. Every human behavior, every decision, every action, every moment of what feels like free choice is the product of identifiable biological and environmental causes. Not vaguely, not approximately, but specifically. The neurotransmitter levels in your brain right now are the product of your genes, your diet, your sleep last night, the stress you've experienced in the past week, the hormonal fluctuations driven by your endocrine system, the neural circuits that process moral decisions were shaped by your childhood experiences, your culture, your education. The probability that you will act aggressively in a given situation is influenced by your testosterone level, your serotonin transporter genotype, whether you were abused as a child, whether you slept well, whether your blood glucose is low. All of these factors, genetic, developmental, hormonal, cultural, situational, are causes of your behavior. Causes that trace back through chains of prior causes to circumstances that were never in your control. The person who commits a violent crime does so because of a specific combination of biological and environmental factors that, when you trace them back far enough, none of them chose. The person who shows extraordinary compassion does so because of a different combination of factors that, traced back, they also didn't choose. Sapolsky isn't saying all behavior is identical or that circumstances don't matter. He's saying that behavior is always caused by factors that ultimately trace to causes outside the agent's control, and that once you accept this fully, the concept of desert evaporates. Not the concept of responsibility in the practical consequentialist sense, but desert the idea that someone truly, ultimately deserved what happened to them in a way that justifies punishment for its own sake rather than for its practical effects. This is a radical conclusion, and Sapolsky draws it fully. He argues that the retributive justice system, the idea that punishment is justified as payback, as giving people what they deserve, has no foundation once you take the science seriously. People do what they do because of causes outside their control. Punishing them as if they could have done otherwise is, on this view, a kind of category error, like punishing a thermostat for making the room too cold. Now let me be honest about a significant objection to this position, because I think it's important. The objection is practical. Even if libertarian free will doesn't exist, even if people's behavior is entirely the product of prior causes, the practice of holding people responsible, of rewarding and punishing behavior, might be itself one of those prior causes. It might be an input into the causal system that shapes future behavior. Punishment deters future crimes by the punished individual and by others who observe the punishment. Reward reinforces pro-social behavior. The practices of moral responsibility, even without the metaphysical foundation of ultimate desert, might be practically indispensable. This is the compatibilist response to Sapolsky, and it's a serious one. We don't need free will to justify a justice system. We need a justice system that works, that reduces harm, that promotes flourishing. That changes the causal inputs into future behavior in ways that lead to better outcomes. Incarceration can be justified not because the criminal deserved it, but because it protects others and potentially rehabilitates the offender. Social recognition of heroic behavior can be justified not because the hero truly deserved praise, but because praising heroism makes heroic behavior more likely in the future. Sapolsky largely agrees with this consequentialist reframing of the justice system. His argument is not that we should abandon all responses to behavior. It's that we should abandon the retributive framing, the they deserved it framing, and replace it with a consequentialist, therapeutic, public health framing. The question shouldn't be, does this person deserve punishment? It should be, what response to this behavior will lead to the best outcomes for this person, for potential victims, and for society? This reframing has real significant implications for criminal justice. It points toward longer investment in rehabilitation. It points against punitive prison conditions that serve no rehabilitative or deterrent purpose. It points toward addressing the social, biological, and developmental causes of crime, poverty, childhood trauma, mental illness, substance abuse, rather than treating crime as a moral failing that calls for punishment as an end in itself. Now, I want to come to something that I think is philosophically underappreciated in these discussions. It has to do with the relationship between the absence of free will and the practices of emotional response that constitute our moral lives. The philosopher P.F. Strawson, not Galen Strawson, his father, writing in 1962, argued that the question of whether determinism is true is largely irrelevant to the practices of holding each other responsible, because those practices are grounded not in metaphysical facts about causal origination, but in what he called reactive attitudes, the emotional responses that naturally arise in relationships between persons. Gratitude, resentment, indignation, admiration, love, contempt, these are the basic currencies of moral life. They're not theoretical conclusions about the metaphysics of causation. They're emotional responses to how people treat each other, to the goodwill or ill will, the care or indifference that people display in their interactions. Strawson argues that these reactive attitudes are so fundamental to human relationships, so constitutive of what it means to engage with others as persons rather than objects, that no theoretical argument, however compelling, could give us reason to abandon them wholesale, even if we came to believe fully in determinism, even if we accepted that the person who harmed us couldn't have done otherwise. The resentment we feel toward them for the harm would be appropriate. Not because they could have chosen differently in the libertarian sense, but because resentment is the appropriate response to ill will directed at oneself. It's part of the grammar of being a person among persons. This is a profound and, I think, largely correct point. The absence of libertarian free will doesn't make the reactive attitudes irrational. It requires us to understand them differently, not as responses to ultimate desert, but as responses to the quality of will that others display toward us, which are themselves appropriate inputs into the ongoing dynamics of human relationships. When someone wrongs you, resentment is appropriate not because they could have done otherwise in the libertarian sense, but because resentment is part of how relationships between persons work. It signals that something important has been violated. It creates pressure for repair, apology, change. When someone does something admirable, admiration is appropriate not because they truly deserved it in the ultimate sense, but because admiration is part of how we recognize and reinforce the goods we value in each other. The emotional fabric of moral life survives the death of libertarian free will, but it needs to be understood differently, not as tracking ultimate desert, as tracking the quality of engagement, the goodwill or ill will, the care or indifference that people display toward each other. And this is something that physical determinism doesn't undermine. Even in a deterministic universe, people display varying qualities of will toward each other. Some people's neural circuitry reliably produces kindness and care. Others reliably produces cruelty, and indifference. Responding differently to these different qualities with gratitude and admiration on one side, resentment and indignation on the other, is appropriate regardless of whether those qualities were determined by prior causes. Let me now go somewhere that most discussions of free will avoid, because it requires confronting something genuinely uncomfortable about our self-understanding. What does it mean to live well in a world without libertarian free will? Not at the level of justice systems and social policy, though those matter enormously. At the personal level, at the level of your experience of your own life, your relationship to your own choices, your sense of your own agency, one response is a kind of liberating deflation. If you're not the ultimate author of your character, if your values and tendencies and ways of being in the world were shaped by forces you didn't control, then the weight of self-blame for your failures and perhaps the inflation of pride for your successes can be appropriately adjusted. The person who struggles with addiction isn't a moral failure. They're someone whose biology, developmental history, and circumstances have converged on a particular neural pattern that makes certain behaviors compulsive. The person who finds compassion easy isn't morally superior. They're someone whose nature and history have made compassion the natural response to suffering. This doesn't mean the struggling addict and the naturally compassionate person are the same. It means the basis of our response to them should shift away from moral judgment toward understanding, toward identifying what supports flourishing and what doesn't. Away from desert and toward need. Away from blame and toward causal explanation followed by intervention. The philosopher Dirk Pereboom calls this the therapeutic stance. Rather than responding to oneself and others with praise and blame, which presuppose ultimate desert, we respond with understanding and support, addressing the causal factors that lead to harmful behavior, reinforcing the causal factors that lead to flourishing. Not because people aren't real, or their choices don't matter, or the differences between people are insignificant, but because the appropriate response to a caused system is to understand its causes and intervene thoughtfully in those causes, not to punish it for being the way it is. I want to tell you about a recent study that I think illustrates the practical stakes of all this with unusual clarity. Researchers presented subjects with information about the neurobiological causes of criminal behavior, specifically how factors like prefrontal cortex damage, childhood trauma, and genetic predispositions toward impulsivity increase the probability of violent crime. Subjects who read this information subsequently showed reduced support for retributive punishment, punishment justified as giving offenders what they deserve, and increased support for rehabilitative approaches. In other words, when people understand the causal structure of behavior, when they see concretely that behavior is caused by identifiable biological and environmental factors, their intuitive retributive impulses weaken. The science, when internalized, moves people toward a more consequentialist, therapeutic approach to wrongdoing. This is important because it suggests that the denial of free will, or rather the accurate understanding of what causes behavior, has practical consequences for how we respond to each other. Not by eliminating accountability or dissolving all distinctions between harmful and beneficial behavior, but by shifting the framing from desert to causation, from punishment to intervention, from moral blame to understanding. And this shift, if it were adopted at the level of social policy, could have profound consequences. The United States incarcerates more people per capita than almost any country in the world. A significant fraction of that incarceration is driven by retributive logic. People deserve to suffer for what they've done. If we replace that logic with a consequentialist therapeutic logic, what response will reduce future harm and promote flourishing? The criminal justice system would look dramatically different. Not softer. Necessarily dangerous people still need to be kept from harming others, but differently justified and differently structured. The absence of free will, taken seriously, is not a philosophical curiosity. It's a challenge to the foundations of how we respond to wrongdoing. Now let me come to something that I've been circling around and want to address directly, because there's a deep tension in how we live that the physics and neuroscience of free will creates, and I don't want to paper over it. You will continue to experience deliberation as real. You will continue to feel yourself as an agent, weighing options, choosing. You will continue to feel pride when you do something admirable and shame when you fail. You will continue to feel resentment when someone wrongs you and gratitude when someone helps you. These experiences are not going to go away because you've been convinced by the argument from determinism or the block universe or the Libet experiments, and this creates what philosophers call the phenomenological tension of free will denial. You can intellectually accept that libertarian free will doesn't exist and simultaneously be incapable of living as if it didn't. The experience of agency is so fundamental, so deeply built into the architecture of conscious experience that it persists even when you know better. Some philosophers, most notably Saul Smolansky, have taken this to a radical conclusion. Smolansky argues that the truth about free will is so psychologically devastating, so thoroughly undermining of the practices and beliefs that make human life livable, that it should be kept from public awareness. That a benevolent illusion, the illusion of free will, is necessary for human flourishing. That the truth is too corrosive to share widely. I disagree strongly. Not because the truth isn't uncomfortable, it is, but because the history of human thought is full of truths that were initially threatening and ultimately liberating. The Copernican revolution removed Earth from the center of the cosmos and ultimately gave us cosmology. The Darwinian revolution removed humans from the center of the biological world and ultimately gave us medicine, ecology, evolutionary psychology. The truths that most threaten our self-importance have historically been the truths that most expanded our understanding. The truth about free will, that we are not the ultimate authors of ourselves, that our choices flow from causes we didn't choose, is uncomfortable. But it's also an invitation to understand ourselves more clearly, to respond to each other more wisely, to build institutions more honestly aligned with what actually causes human behavior. The experience of agency, of deliberation, of choosing is real, even if libertarian free will is not. It's a real feature of how certain physical systems, brains like ours, process information and generate behavior. The deliberation is causally efficacious. The reasons we cite do influence the outcome. The experience of weighing options is part of the causal process that produces the action. What's not real is the picture of a self standing outside the causal order, freely originating actions from a position of ultimate control. That picture is what the physics dissolves. But the causally efficacious deliberating agent, the person whose reasoning processes genuinely influence outcomes, that survives. Deflated, understood differently, but real. Let me close this part with something that I think captures the deepest implication of the physics for our understanding of ourselves. In our conversation about consciousness, we explored the possibility that consciousness might be fundamental, that experience might be woven into the fabric of reality at every level. And we explored the implications of the block universe, that all moments of time, past and future, exist with equal reality in the four-dimensional structure of space-time. Now, bring those two ideas together in the context of free will. If consciousness is fundamental, if experience is a basic feature of reality, then the experience of deliberation, of agency, of choosing is real in a deep sense. Not a byproduct, not an illusion, a genuine feature of the universe. The felt sense of weighing options and arriving at a decision is as real as any physical event. But if the block universe is right, If all moments of time exist simultaneously in a four-dimensional structure, then the outcome of that deliberation is already determined. Not in the sense of being pre-calculated by some external observer, but in the sense of already existing as a fixed feature of the space-time manifold. The deliberation is real. The outcome is fixed. Both are simultaneously true. This is not a contradiction. It's a description of what it's like to be a conscious agent embedded in space-time. The experience of deliberating toward an open future is real. It's what the present moment feels like from inside. The fixedness of the outcome is real. It's what the four-dimensional structure looks like from outside. Both perspectives are valid. Neither is more fundamental. And in that recognition that the experience of agency and the determinedness of the outcome are both real features of different perspectives on the same event, there's something that I find strangely more satisfying than either extreme. Not the naive libertarian picture of a free self standing outside causation. Not the eliminativist picture of a zombie brain mechanically processing inputs. But something in between. A deliberating, experiencing, causally efficacious agent fully embedded in the causal and temporal structure of the universe, participating genuinely in the unfolding of events. While that unfolding is, from the four-dimensional perspective, already complete, you are real. Your deliberation is real. Your choices have real causal effects. You are not a passive observer of a predetermined show. You are an active participant in the unfolding, even if that unfolding, viewed from outside time, was always going to be exactly what it is. That's the strange, vertiginous, strangely liberating truth that physics has to offer on the question of free will. And in part 3, I want to take it all the way home to what it means to live with this knowledge, how the wisest traditions in human thought have actually been pointing at this truth for centuries without the benefit of the physics, and what the absence of libertarian free will implies for the most important questions of all: how we should treat each other, what justice actually means, and what kind of world we should be trying to build. So we'd arrived at this strange, vertiginous place where the physics and the neuroscience and the philosophy are all pointing in the same direction. Libertarian free will, the kind where you are the ultimate originating author of your choices, where you genuinely could have done otherwise, doesn't exist. The block universe has already written every moment. The neural machinery precedes the conscious decision. The causal chain runs from the Big Bang through the configuration of your neurons to the action that feels most intimately yours. And yet, the experience of deliberation is real. The causal efficacy of reasoning is real. The differences between people in character, in values, in the quality of will they bring to their interactions with others are real and matter enormously. The practices of moral life, gratitude, resentment, admiration, love are appropriate responses to how people engage with each other, regardless of whether that engagement was determined by prior causes. So what do we do with all of this? How do we live, actually live, not just philosophize in the light of what physics and neuroscience tell us about the nature of choice? That's what I want to work through in this final part. Not abstractly, concretely, with specific implications for how we treat ourselves, how we treat each other, and how we build the institutions that organize our collective life. Let me start with something that might seem surprising, given everything we've discussed. I want to make the case that understanding the absence of free will should make us more compassionate, not less responsible. Not more permissive, more compassionate, and more honest about why. Here's the core insight. Every person you encounter, every person whose behavior you respond to with admiration or contempt, with gratitude or resentment, with trust or suspicion, is the product of a specific history, a specific genome, a specific developmental environment, a specific set of formative experiences, a specific cultural context, a specific neurobiological architecture. They didn't choose any of these things. They arrived in the world with a particular nature. and that nature was then shaped by circumstances that were equally unchosen. This doesn't mean all behaviors are equivalent. It doesn't mean the person who shows consistent kindness is the same as the person who shows consistent cruelty. The differences are real, they matter, they're appropriate objects of our reactive attitudes, our gratitude and resentment, our admiration and contempt. But what it does mean is that the moral disgust we sometimes feel toward people who behave badly, the sense that they are fundamentally, deeply, irredeemably bad in a way that calls for suffering as an end in itself, that response is based on a picture of those people as ultimate self-authors that the physics doesn't support. The person who does terrible things is a person whose specific history has produced a specific neural architecture that generates those behaviors. That history, however bad the behaviors it produced, is not something they authored. I want to be very careful here, because this point is often misunderstood. I am not saying that terrible behavior should be tolerated, or that dangerous people shouldn't be prevented from harming others, or that the harm done by cruel people is somehow diminished by the fact that they were caused to be cruel. The harm is real. The response needs to be real. But the framing of that response, the difference between you deserve to suffer and we need to understand what produced this behavior and prevent future harm, matters enormously for what kind of response we actually build. The neuroscientist and author Robert Sapolsky puts it this way: when a bridge collapses, we don't blame the bridge. We investigate the materials, the engineering, the conditions that led to the failure. We try to understand what went wrong so that future bridges don't fail in the same way. This is not a soft or permissive response to a catastrophic event. It's a rigorous, serious, consequentially important response. It's the response that actually leads to better bridges. We don't apply this logic to people. When a person does something terrible, we want to blame them, to hold them personally, ultimately responsible, to make them suffer for what they did. This response feels morally necessary. It feels like justice. But it's built on a picture of the person as an uncaused cause, as someone who could have done otherwise in a way that the physics doesn't support. The bridge analogy is imperfect, and Sapolsky acknowledges this. People are not bridges. They have experiences. They respond to incentives. They can be changed by consequences in ways that bridges cannot. The practices of accountability that we apply to people, including consequences for harmful behavior, serve functions that go beyond explanation and prevention. They're part of the ongoing dynamics of relationships between persons. They signal what we value. They maintain the social fabric. But the framing matters. You deserve to suffer versus what produced this and what will prevent it leads to very different responses. And only one of them is grounded in the actual causal structure of human behavior. Now let me take you to something that I find genuinely fascinating, the way that several of the great wisdom traditions in human history have been pointing at something very close to the truth about free will, long before we had the physics to formalize it. The Stoics, the Greek and Roman philosophers of the first few centuries, BCE and CE, built an entire philosophy around a fundamental distinction. They distinguished between what is up to us and what is not up to us. Up to us, our judgments, our intentions, our responses to what happens. Not up to us, external circumstances, other people's behavior, outcomes in the world, even our own bodies and their conditions. The Stoic sage doesn't rage against the things that are not up to them. They accept the external order, what the Stoics call the logos, the rational structure of the cosmos as given, and they focus their energy entirely on what is genuinely within their power. Their own response to circumstances, their own inner life, their own character as expressed in action. This is strikingly compatible with what physics tells us about free will. The Stoics didn't have the block universe or the Libet experiments, but they arrived through philosophical reflection and the observation of human experience at a picture of human agency that locates freedom not in libertarian self-origination, but in the quality of one's engagement with what happens. Not in escaping the causal order, but in aligning oneself with it, in understanding one's nature and circumstances clearly, and responding from one's deepest values rather than from reactive impulse. Marcus Aurelius, Roman emperor, Stoic philosopher, one of the most thoughtful human beings who ever lived, wrote in his private journal, The Meditations, something that I find resonant across 2,000 years. He wrote about the importance of understanding that every person who wrongs you is doing so because of their nature, their ignorance, their history, not because they are fundamentally evil in some metaphysically absolute sense, but because they are what they are, shaped as they have been shaped, and the appropriate response is not rage and resentment, which harm the person who feels them, but clear-eyed understanding followed by whatever action is appropriate to the circumstances. This is not passivity. Marcus was an emperor who made decisions of enormous consequence. He wasn't suggesting that nothing matters or that all responses are equivalent. He was suggesting that the framing of our responses from understanding rather than from blame leads to better decisions and a better life. The Buddhist tradition makes a similar move. The concept of karma, in its philosophical rather than popular form, is not about cosmic punishment and reward. It's about the causal structure of the mind. Actions condition future mental states. Habits of mind become character. Character generates action. The entire cycle is causal, each moment arising from prior moments. And liberation nirvana is not escape from causation, but a clear seeing of causation that removes the reactive, clinging, blame-laden responses that cause suffering. The Buddhist concept of compassion, karuna, specifically involves recognizing that suffering arises from causes and conditions. That the person who causes harm is themselves suffering, caught in patterns of thought and behavior that arise from causes they didn't ultimately control. This doesn't mean harm should be ignored or that boundaries shouldn't be maintained. It means the response comes from understanding rather than from contempt. Stoicism and Buddhism are not the same. They differ in important ways about the nature of the self, about what constitutes flourishing, about many things, but they share this, a recognition that the moral life is not primarily about assigning ultimate desert, about giving people what they truly deserve in some cosmic sense. It's about understanding the causal structure of mind and behavior and responding in ways that reduce suffering and promote flourishing. 2,000 years before the block universe, 2,000 years before the Libet experiments, the wisest traditions in human history were already pointing toward the same conclusion that modern physics supports. Let me now address something that I think is the deepest practical question raised by the absence of free will. Not how we respond to wrongdoing, though that matters enormously, but how we respond to ourselves. Because the argument from determinism in the block universe doesn't just apply to other people, it applies to you, to your failures, your regrets, your sense of having let yourself or others down, to the narrative you've constructed about who you are and what you've done. Most people carry a substantial weight of self-blame. Regrets about decisions made and not made, about character flaws that have caused harm, about moments of weakness or cruelty or cowardice that still sting in memory. This self-blame is, in many cases, a chronic source of suffering. And it's built on exactly the same picture of ultimate desert that we've been questioning in the context of criminal justice. The implicit assumption is, I could have done otherwise. I should have done otherwise. I deserve to feel bad about what I did. But in the deterministic picture or the block universe picture, you couldn't have done otherwise. Not in the libertarian sense. The person you were at that moment, with that history, in those circumstances, with those neural states, that person did what they did. The outcome was, in a specific physical sense, inevitable given the initial conditions. Now, I want to be very careful here because this can be misread as a kind of license for moral complacency. If I couldn't have done otherwise, why bother trying to do better? If my bad decisions were causally inevitable, why feel any regret? But this misreads the implication. Because the same determinism that made your past actions inevitable also makes your future actions the product of your current states, including your current understanding, your current commitments, your current values. The regret you feel about past behavior is part of the causal input into future behavior. Thoughtful self-reflection, honest acknowledgement of harm done, genuine commitment to doing differently, these are real causal interventions in the system that generates your behavior. They matter. They work. What doesn't serve any purpose, what causes chronic suffering without producing beneficial change, is the kind of self-blame that's rooted in the belief that you truly, ultimately deserve to have been better. That you were a free agent who chose failure when you could have chosen success, and that you therefore deserve to feel bad about yourself in an ongoing, punishing way. That belief is not only philosophically unsupported, it's practically counterproductive. Research in psychology consistently shows that self-compassion, treating yourself with the same understanding and care you'd extend to a friend who had failed, leads to better outcomes than self-criticism. People who practice self-compassion are more resilient, more motivated to change, more honest with themselves about their failures. They spend less energy on the paralyzing shame of I am fundamentally bad, and more energy on the productive question, what would it take to do better? Self-compassion is not self-indulgence, it's not the absence of standards. It's the recognition that you are a cause system, that your failures had causes, many of them outside your control, and that understanding those causes is more useful than punishing yourself for having them. The physics of free will, applied to self-understanding, points toward exactly the same conclusion as modern psychology. Not permissiveness, not low standards, but understanding in place of contempt, including contempt for yourself. I want to now address one of the most interesting recent developments in the scientific study of belief in free will, because it turns out that people's beliefs about free will have measurable effects on their behavior. And the effects are more complex than simple believe in free will, behave well, disbelieve, behave badly. Early studies suggested that inducing disbelief in free will through reading a passage arguing that free will doesn't exist made people more likely to cheat in subsequent tasks and less likely to help others. This was taken as evidence that belief in free will is socially necessary, that free will is a beneficial fiction, that people need to behave prosocially. But more recent, more careful research has complicated this picture considerably. The effects of free will disbelief on behavior appear to be mediated by other factors, particularly whether the disbelief leads to fatalism, nothing I do matters, or to understanding my behavior is caused and therefore changeable. When people are given a more nuanced picture, not you have no control, but your behavior is the product of causes that can be understood and changed, the antisocial effects largely disappear. In some conditions, understanding the causal structure of behavior actually increases prosocial motivation, because people see more clearly how their actions affect others through causal pathways. The worry that free will denial leads to moral nihilism appears to be based on a specific reductive version of determinism, the nothing matters version, rather than on the more nuanced, causally sophisticated version that Sapolsky and others are actually arguing for. The nuanced version doesn't say nothing matters. It says everything matters, causes matter, conditions matter, the quality of will people bring to their interactions matters, but the appropriate response to what matters is understanding and intervention, not desert, and punishment. Let me now come to the question that has been implicit throughout this entire conversation, and that I want to make explicit. If libertarian free will doesn't exist, And if the appropriate response to behavior is understanding and intervention rather than desert and punishment, what does justice actually mean? The retributive answer is familiar. Justice means giving people what they deserve, proportional response to wrongdoing, making the guilty suffer as an end in itself, because suffering is what wrongdoing deserves. If libertarian free will doesn't exist, retributive justice has no foundation. Not because wrongdoing doesn't matter, it does enormously. But because desert, in the ultimate sense, requires ultimate authorship, and the physics doesn't support ultimate authorship, the consequentialist answer is different. Justice means producing the best outcomes, reducing harm, protecting the innocent, rehabilitating offenders where possible, incapacitating those who remain dangerous, deterring potential wrongdoers. Justice, on this view, is a system of social responses to behavior that aims at future flourishing, not past desert. This is a demanding vision. It requires actually investing in rehabilitation, in the education, mental health treatment, substance abuse treatment, vocational training that actually change the causal factors that produce criminal behavior. It requires honesty about the fact that many of our current punitive practices, long sentences, brutal prison conditions, the permanent stigma of criminal records do not reduce crime and cause enormous suffering. It requires treating crime as a public health problem with the investment in prevention and treatment that public health problems require. And it requires giving up something psychologically significant, the satisfaction of retribution, the felt sense of cosmic balance restored by making the wrongdoer suffer. This is real. It's a genuine feature of human psychology, but it's built on a philosophical picture of ultimate desert, of a self that stands outside causation that physics doesn't support. I am not saying this transition is easy. I'm not saying the retributive intuitions are simply wrong in all their dimensions. P. F. Strawson's point about reactive attitudes stands. Resentment toward those who harm us is appropriate and intelligible regardless of determinism. The emotional responses that constitute our moral lives are not dissolved by the physics of free will. But there's a difference between the natural reactive attitude of resentment, which is appropriate and doesn't require libertarian free will, and the institutional practice of inflicting suffering as an end in itself, because people deserve it. The first is a feature of human psychology that physics can't and shouldn't dissolve. The second is a philosophical foundation for institutional practice that physics genuinely undermines. The justice system built on the second has produced in many countries institutions that cause enormous harm to enormous numbers of people, largely to no good consequentialist purpose. A justice system built on the first acknowledging the reactive attitudes as real, while grounding institutional responses in consequentialist considerations, would look dramatically different, more humane, more effective, more honest, about what actually reduces harm. Let me come finally to where all of this leaves us. Not at the level of policy, at the level of experience, of living. You will wake up tomorrow and make choices. You will deliberate. You will weigh options. You will feel the weight of decision. And the outcomes will matter to you, to the people around you, to the small and large projects of your life. None of that is diminished by the physics we've discussed. The deliberation is real. The causal efficacy of your reasoning is real. The difference between a life of careful, values-guided engagement and a life of reactive, unconsidered impulse is real and enormous. The physics doesn't dissolve these differences. It explains them, and in explaining them, it points toward how we can actually change them. Because here is the deepest practical implication of taking the science of free will seriously. If behavior is caused, if your patterns of thought and action arise from identifiable biological and developmental and situational factors, then those factors can, in principle, be changed. Not through sheer force of libertarian will, you don't have that, but through the real causal levers that influence neural architecture and behavioral pattern, through practice, through environment, through relationships, through therapy, through the gradual, effortful, genuinely difficult work of changing the causes of your behavior rather than simply willing your behavior to be different. This is what the Stoics understood, what the Buddhist tradition understands, what modern neuroscience is beginning to formalize. You cannot simply decide to be different through an act of pure libertarian will. But you can place yourself in environments that shape you differently. You can practice different responses until they become the neural defaults. You can work on understanding the causes of your worst patterns, rather than simply blaming yourself for having them. This is harder than willing yourself to be better. It's also more effective because it works with causation rather than against it. It uses the actual machinery of change rather than the illusory lever of uncaused self-creation. I want to close with something that I think captures the full arc of what we've explored from the opening sentence to this final moment. Your choices aren't real. That's what I said at the beginning. And I stand by it in the specific, precise sense that the choices you experience as the product of libertarian free will, of genuine ability to have done otherwise, in the ultimate sense of causal origination from a self standing outside the physical order, those choices, understood that way, are not what's actually happening. But here is what I should also have said from the beginning. Your choices are real in every other sense. They arise from your values, your reasoning, your character, all causally shaped, yes, but genuinely yours. They have real causal effects in the world. They express who you are, even if who you are was shaped by factors you didn't choose. They constitute your contribution to the ongoing causal history of everything that comes after you. And the experience of making them, the felt sense of deliberating, of weighing, of arriving at a decision, is not an illusion to be discarded. It's a real feature of what it's like to be a certain kind of physical system. A feature that evolution produced because it works. Because the systems that deliberate that model possible futures and choose among them navigate the world more successfully than those that don't. The freedom you have is not the freedom to escape causation. It is the freedom, real, valuable, worth protecting and developing, of a cause system whose internal processes include genuine reasoning, genuine valuing, genuine engagement with the world. That freedom is not illusory. It's just not what the word free seems to promise at first glance. And in the gap between the promise and the reality, in the space between what libertarian free will seemed to offer and what the physics actually delivers, there is something unexpected. Something that, if you really sit with it, feels less like loss and more like relief. You are not the ultimate author of yourself. You didn't create your values from nothing, or choose your history, or build your character from scratch by sheer act of will. You are a product of your genes, your development, your culture, your relationships, your experiences, and so is everyone else. Which means the person who has failed you, who has caused you harm, who has disappointed you, who has not lived up to what you needed from them, they too are a product of their history, of their biology, of circumstances that shaped them before they had any say in the matter. And the compassion, that appropriate understanding, calls for not the compassion that excuses harm or ignores the reality of its effects, but the compassion that recognizes shared causation, shared vulnerability, shared embeddedness in a causal order that none of us authored. That compassion is both philosophically justified and practically powerful. The physics of free will doesn't give you less of a reason to treat people well. It gives you a deeper reason. Not they deserve kindness because they earned it through free choices, but they are what their history made them, as I am what mine made me. And understanding that is the beginning of wisdom about how to live with each other. Your choices aren't real in the libertarian sense, but you are. Completely, causally, consequentially, beautifully real. Embedded in a universe that was always going to include this moment, this precise configuration of matter and energy and information that is you reading these words, thinking these thoughts, feeling whatever you're feeling right now. And what you do next, however determined, however fixed in the block universe's four-dimensional structure, will be the expression of everything you are. Make it good, not because you deserve credit for it, because it matters.